This is Karma Bauman, and you'll also see Ben on the video as well. Welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning. This morning we'll be covering the last two chapters of part 3 of the Untracked book. Before we get into the material, a couple logistics, and then also kind of tell you where I'm at and where Ben's at this morning. First of all, logistics on how to use this platform. If you're not familiar with this platform, you will see in the top right of your screen a moderated chat box. And at the bottom of that box is where you can participate in the webinar. You can ask questions or comments, and then just click send, and that will come just to Ben and I, and we will see those at our end and we'll respond accordingly. And we certainly invite you to do that. We love interaction. And the other way to participate is below the video is a button that says, I believe it says ask a question. Click on that and you can participate verbally by using the microphone on your end. And you can just speak your question or comment. We certainly invite you to do that as well if you're comfortable with that. If you're joining us by phone, I believe it's *5 will prompt us at this end that you would like to speak, and then we'll turn the mic over to you. You'll be prompted with that as well. So I think that's it as far as logistics. Again, thank you for joining us. We always appreciate you taking time out of your early Sunday mornings to join us for these next 35 to 45 minutes as we talk about the book Untracked, which Ben had authored that book, and it came out maybe a year and a half ago, I think it is now. Okay, as an introduction to the material this morning, we read two chapters. One was called How is Christianity Influenced? Actually, let me tell you where I'm at before we get into the material, because you see this behind me. I'm actually in Iowa, so I'm in a different state than Ben this morning. He's still in Colorado. I came to Iowa earlier this week to help my sister out. She had a surprise happen. I think it's been almost 2 months now. It'll be 2 months at the end of September. She was getting a roof job done, and as she says, it's a roof job gone awry. They left one of the pipes exposed as they were doing their roofing project, and of course that night it decided to dump rain, and they had buckets, they had trash bins, trash cans in half of the house trying to catch all the rain that was pouring in that night. So it basically destroyed nearly half of the house. So half the house is gutted out. So behind me what you see is the ceiling that is no longer there. So we're in the process of getting all that repaired. She lost her husband a couple years ago, so she's kind of in charge of the whole thing. So I came back just to kind of be a moral support for her. So I'm back here just for a couple more days before I return to Iowa. So it's been good. She's been able to make a lot of decisions over the past few days, and the project is moving forward. So I'm glad to be able to have the flexibility to come back and help her. So that's what you see behind me. I'm sitting in the living room. You see the refrigerator behind me, that's in her dining room. And then the roof there is above the dining area and the kitchen area and all the way down the hallway, actually. So, all right, let's talk about the material that we're covering this week. It was interesting as I read these chapters this morning, titled How is Christianity Influenced by Capitalism, and then the chapter called Trust. And my mind went in several directions as I read these chapters. I think how I want to start this is with one of the questions that was in the discussion questions for the first chapter. And that question is, do you think capitalism has influenced the church? And my response to that question before I met Ben and Brenda years ago would have been, no, I was kind of blinded to that. Now that I've have spoken with Ben about this numerous times over the years, I begin to understand how capitalism has influenced the church. And as I read this chapter, when I finished the chapter, there's a list in the chapter of different aspects of how capitalism has influenced the church. And so I just wrote that list down on my little journal. And then I thought to myself, how would that compare if I was to think of how Jesus lived his life? What would that list look like? So I'm just going to share this with you of what I came up with and kind of compare the two lists. So in the capitalist list, if you will, how it's influenced the church, I just have the same bullet points that were in that chapter. We have consumerism, we have economic privilege, we have exclusiveness, we have the benefits for the investors, and we have the focus on brand. And if you read that chapter, you'll understand how those aspects influence the church. But then when I thought of how Jesus lived his life, I made what I call the Jesus list. And when I think about how Jesus lived his life, or how I believe he wants us to live our lives, that list would include love others, serve others, lay down your life. And I also included fruit of the Spirit. So joy and peace and love and gentleness, patience, kindness, etc. And that list is a lot different than what we saw in the capitalist list, if you will. So maybe again, comes back to that question: do you think capitalism has influenced the church? I would say yes. And I think back to the different churches I've attended. Some have been more influenced than others. But just interesting perspective about that all. So I think Ben is going to expand on that a lot more, as well as going through the trust chapter. So we're going to turn it over to Ben, and he can continue sharing his thoughts.
Okay, thank you, Karma, and great thoughts this morning that you started us with, and just this whole idea of how we are influenced by our Western culture. And I'm calling it Western culture, but it's really truly our U.S. culture that has influenced us greatly. You know, for years now, it has been cringeworthy for me whenever I would hear someone say, "We are a Christian nation." And they would almost always use it in reference of or in defense of something that we were doing, or in defense of something that we as a church ought to be doing, or in defense of political stands or those kinds of things. And I would cringe because I knew what was coming, and I knew that it wouldn't be something that related to how Jesus would do things, but our rights that we now assumed that we had because we were the power people. We were in control. We were in charge of a nation. It was a Christian nation. So it ought to do things a certain way. And I would cringe at that because it's so opposite of what Jesus starts us with, what he turns us toward. It's so different than all of that. It's something that is foreign to the gospel, but we came to just accept it and think that it was all about what we thought it should be, that as a Christian nation with us in charge, then this is how we do things. And uh, Scripture doesn't refer to nations as Christian, but neither does it even refer to individuals so much as Christian in that sense. But it talks about a way to live, and it was known as the way among the early Christians. And that was this way that you brought up, Karma, this whole idea that we live differently. We love others, and we're the ones that um, the culture around us looks at and says, "Oh man, that was a selfish move on our part." But there are some people that are living differently. Look at them. They live differently. The way they live is the way we ought to live. And this whole idea that if we are endorsed as the majority religion, if we are the ones that they say we are a Christian nation because there's so many of us, then our government or our culture, if it endorses that, it puts us in this kind of interesting position because it, we become endangered by the whole idea that we will take on the culture, and instead of becoming the voice of God within the culture. And that's so important. So important that we are the eyes and the ears, the hands and the feet of God in the culture around us. Because, and you will find this in both of these chapters, and I'll spend more time on it as we go along today, but the, the issue in any culture is not an issue of whether the culture itself is good or bad, or the governing structures are good or bad as far as structures. You can have a monarchy that's good. You can have a dictatorship that is good. You can have a communist or a socialist structure that is good if selflessness, and take note of that, if selflessness is what's at the foundation of it. So if you have a monarch who is selfless and cares about his people, he will govern well. Now, the same is true of capitalism. As an economic system, if we have selflessness ruling it, it works well. But if we have selfishness ruling it, it's the same as having a selfish monarch. It's the same as having a selfish dictator. It's the same as having selfish leaders in whatever position or whatever structure that our country has. And what happens is if we become cultural tools, as we tend to when we keep saying we're a Christian nation, we become cultural tools of the, the culture we have set up, then we blindly capitulate to its weaknesses. We blindly overlook them. We think that capitalism is somehow special. No, it isn't that capitalism is somehow special. It is simply that we've found a way that works if we will be selfless. But if we're selfish, it still doesn't promote the way of Jesus. So we must always converse about this whole idea of how are we making God visible in our culture? Are we allowing people to see him, or are we just defending the fact that more people say they're Christians here than other places? I think Western culture has permeated the church in Western culture. It's its thinking has made it so that we've become political in nature, and we basically follow the culture, and we think somehow because it's a blind capitulation. Remember that it's not something that we can just look at and say every day we see, oh, we see what's happening here. We just normally live out this culture that we live in, and it permeates our thought processes, and we need to look at finding ways in our culture to stop a lot of this. You see the ones I've mentioned here, the consumerism. Whoever has the best marketing campaign coupled with the most benefits wins. So our churches are rated on their buildings, they're rated on their worship, they're rated on their programs, their publicity, whether they serve good coffee or not, whether I'm going to go there. And I think it'd be a good question. Carmen and I were talking about it earlier, just back and forth here right before this started. What makes the church successful in people's eyes? That's an interesting thought because in our eyes, in today's world, oh, who has the best worship team? Whose preacher is the best? Uh, you know, what building's the nicest? Um, who has the best social hour beforehand? All of those things, and who's then among denominations? There's competition on issues. Who has the strongest issues? Then we look at things like exclusivism. Who attends our church? Is it up and coming, or is it all people from the wrong side of the tracks? Um, all of those things are there. Uh, the in a capitalistic society, we worry about our investors. In fact, my son Corey and I were just talking this week about some of the laws around corporations, and uh, it's it's important and essential in corporations that um, we do everything for the benefit of the investors. So you have a bottom line, and your profit has to be there. You're working to benefit your investors. Well, we do that in the church. We're the investors, and so what are we giving them? It takes up literally 98% in the American church, 98% of our finances in the church go to benefits to members. And those benefits are obviously they come across in all kinds of ways. They're the programs, um, all the different kinds of programs we have. They are the the nice facilities, the easy parking in and out. Um, there are all of those the air conditioned, comfortable pews or seats or however we do it, and we focus on the brand. But those are just some of the influences of capitalism. There's many others you can find in many different ways. And we think because we've grown up in that, we think that that's what God wants. And I question that because it certainly isn't the model that Jesus gives us. It's not that model at all. In fact, when we go to the next chapter, and I'm going to put these two chapters together as we do this, the chapter on trust, we find something that's, I think, really interesting. And that is that it's in that capitalistic culture nature that people have lost trust because we don't trust people that we know are selfish. Selfishness in government, selfishness in business, selfishness in religion, in education, in any area, creates a problem of lack of trust. When people look at others and they say all they're doing is taking care of themselves, they cease to trust them. But when people look at others and they say, oh my, that person cares about what happens to me, they trust them then. And as long as they know that that person isn't thinking just of themselves, but is thinking strongly of the needs of others, they trust that person because they feel like they're looking out for them, feel like they actually care about what happens to them. Otherwise, it's just a dog eat dog world and very difficult for all of us. And so, this whole idea of selfishness versus selflessness is what Jesus brings to us. Is this we can be selfless, we can give ourselves away. And the basis of it, you hear me saying over and over in its simplicity, is this: I treat others like I would like to be treated. I treat others like I would like to be treated. That works with almost anything, any kind of cultural structure. It works. It's that every cultural structure fights with this human tendency, and that's the tendency toward taking care of ourselves and not worrying about how we take care of others. And selfishness ambushes all of us. Selfishness is one of those things that we don't confess often because we don't like to admit we're selfish. And in fact, it's hard for us even to see it. We excuse selfishness very readily. We can see it in others often. But even that is suspect because we often accuse others of selfishness when it is we ourselves that are selfish. And so this whole thing ambushes us. And so Jesus refers to it and deals with it over and over. And this whole idea of love is that I am not going to treat others selfishly out of my selfish regard for me, but I'm going to treat them like I would hope others would treat me. I'm going to look at them and give myself away to them and know this, that it's in giving myself away to them that others will be trusting and loving and want to give themselves away to me. So Jesus uses phrases like, give and it shall be given unto you. Pressed down, shaken together, and running over will others give into you. And that's because we have given. And it's this giving versus taking idea. And so much of our capitalistic thought today in our culture comes from an author that many of you are familiar with, or at least have heard of, Ayn Rand, who selfishness was a virtue for her. And the whole idea, she, by the way, in case you're one of those that have followed her, she despised Jesus. And all the ideas that come from him, because she wanted to teach the opposite, that this was about selfishness in a society that each person lived to make it better for themselves would work well. But Jesus teaches us something else. Each person that wants to make it better for others makes a society good. And so this whole thing is huge. It's huge because it tells us the nature of God within the culture that we live in. And in today's world, we're taught just by the very nature of everything around us that we have it together in our culture. But I don't think we do. I think Jesus had it together. It's so very different than the way we approach it often. Any comments or questions concerning this? I think
Here's
this, go ahead.
here's a comment about I attended a mega church, and it was their marketing, their appearance, and their worship that attracted me. And as I attended it, I also liked the leadership. They seemed authentic. But as the years went by, it seemed like they became trapped in that. And eventually one of the senior pastor had a falling out, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like what happened there was the appearance of that became more important than really getting the help that was needed as they walked this journey.
And I can't tell you how that is impacted. And it impacts every pastor. It impacts every institution. Um, you have to keep appearances up. It's crazy. You fight for that, and you have to keep satisfaction up. You have to keep people happy. That becomes the foundation for it all. That somehow they've got to come and say, "Oh, I like this church better than that church." What a competitive, um, capitalistic viewpoint, um, related to consumerism and related to preaching our brand and trying to make ourselves look good. So oftentimes it gives itself even to deception because we don't want to face that we're imperfect. In a world that we have to compete with everybody, then we aren't quick to say, I blew that. We're not quick to apologize. We're not quick to say, I was wrong. We're not quick to say, I'm struggling here, because we're always trying to compete, always trying to put the face forward. It's kind of like, to me, as I look at this Wells Fargo bank debacle right now with 5,300 of their employees fired as they were opening accounts for over 2 million of them that have been expressed that falsely, not with people's permission, just so they could get their sales figures up. Well, um, that whole thing is, Wells Fargo now is trying to just simply make it look like they've always been this institution that, oh, wouldn't do those kind of things. They've always had only the customer's good in mind, and they've always been the one forward thinking and all. And as I look at that, I think, oh my goodness, it's this capitalistic culture. We have to keep our edge there so that some other bank, in that case, doesn't get the edge on us. We have to make ourselves look good, no matter what we've done wrong, no matter what we've done. And the church is subject to the same thing in our culture. We have to look better, even though we miss so many of the most important things because of that. Thank you, Karma, for sharing
We
that
have,
thought.
have another comment about, it seems that when I think of people that have lived this out like Jesus would live it out, Mother Teresa comes to mind. And yet she never got caught up in the power of it. I'm curious how she was able to live this out her entire life.
I wish I had I wish I had just some pat answer for that. I think the complexity and the difficulty of that, I know I've read um, a, a number of things, a couple of books that were very, very good biographies of Mother Teresa, and what an incredible example. And how interesting because her purity, her goodness was so amazing. She could walk into the world room with any of the world's greatest leaders, and they were intimidated by this tiny, tiny little lady that just had the power of goodness about her. Um, but how that happens, I don't think it's easy. I don't think I can give a pat answer to it. How you do it, I think it's difficult all the way. When you read about Mother Teresa, one of the things you find is that she doubted herself so much of her life, even at the end. She didn't know if she was good. She didn't know if she could do these things, but she just kept wanting to live out this goodness. She just kept wanting to see Jesus in the least of these. What an incredible focus. Yeah, she brought me to tears because um, we saw in our lifetime one of those people that will go down in history with St. Francis of Assisi, with others that were great saints of the church. We watched her. There's nothing easy about that. But my goodness, how many people in this world have better lives because of her and because of all of those that now have followed in her footsteps? What an incredible thing.
That's an interesting thing then when you mentioned kind of explaining Mother Teresa's life. And one of the things one of the questions I had as I read this and as I hear you sharing thoughts was how so easily we can become blind to, like in this case, the influence of capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we hear how Mother Teresa, how she lived it out so well, yet she often doubted herself.
Oh, yeah.
And so maybe it's the point when we become confident, like when we become confident saying, I'm living this out like Jesus would, or I am doing it right. Maybe that's the cue of when we need to maybe take a step back and really look at, are we being blinded at that point? Because it seems like those that had the most influence are the ones that questioned themselves a lot or doubted and had those kinds of feelings.
And Karma, as I look at that, I think there's something of the nature of humility in that obviously is hard for all of us. There isn't any of us that humility comes easy for. But there's something about this humility, and it's what Jesus uh, what makes him so incredibly special? Here he is, the Son of God, and what's he doing? He's humbling himself, humbling himself. I think that's a process that we do. Um, who being in very, I have that in this chapter, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Oh my goodness.
We have another comment here
Yeah.
that kind of goes along with that. And the comment is the problem with selflessness is that it's hard.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that fear might be a motivation, keeping pastors from challenging their congregation to be selfless. Isn't selfishness the easier choice for pastors, churches, and the people choosing a church to attend?
Oh my. Well, I think that even often in the very things that we teach people in our culture, it's so interesting. We teach them um, to go to people or go to churches with answers, with solutions, who have learned how to run in this world with the publicity correct and the all of the pieces in place, and it's produced Bible Answer Men. It's produced all kinds of things. It's produced stunning corporate structures in churches and denominations. Um, it's produced all kinds of things, but what it probably hasn't produced is selflessness. It hasn't produced people who are just out there giving their lives away. It hasn't probably produced families that simply take in another family. Maybe it hasn't produced Christians that just reach across the street to a Muslim neighbor or across town to a black family um, that maybe has struggled just trying to uh, get ahead in life. It's it hasn't produced the things that it seems like Jesus was producing, but it's produced a success mentality. Uh, I agree. I think selfishness is almost always an easier choice, and selfishness from the top down. It's um, as denominations, as churches, are we selfish in our nature? Are we arrogant sometimes, or are we humble? I think we express just exactly what we as individuals are in those structures. Any other thoughts or comments?
But one of the questions was, from the discussion question was, can we selflessly love the world with our current structures? As I kind of pondered and thought about that, um, it seems the structures sometimes just get in the way. And maybe it's easier just for myself to gather some friends or family members and go do what Jesus did. Go serve the neighbor, or go help the single mom that's struggling, or maybe it's something as simple as making sure I greet somebody along my walk or along my jog or something, versus having to go through a structure, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Because what do we do with the structure oftentimes is we build an internal focus again. We think our Christianity relates to what we do within the structure. So and that's a tiered thing. I that's a crazy piece. This whole idea of tiered worth in our culture. Uh, so what do? We give um, a higher tier to pastors in our church, and then to worship leaders perhaps, or Sunday school teachers and program directors and those type of things, and they get this greater worth. But I think in our culture, um, uh, that's the nature of this capitalistic system, is that we have tiered worth. Um, so the person that maybe needs us to give him value doesn't get the value because he's not doing something. Ah, that was one of the things that I can't tell you. It hurt. People, you would bring them in and they'd have so much to give, but when I say they had so much to give, it wasn't on the same level. So their tiered worth was something much lower in the eyes of the people, and you just fought that. Um, do that in our structures. We give greater worth to some than we do to others. And it just isn't how I see Jesus doing it. So the woman at the well gets worth. The tax collector who would love to be somebody valuable gets worth. And so opposite of our system where we tier, and some people are worth more than others in our eyes. Other thoughts or questions on this? I think as we go along, by the way, we're now moving, as we move to the next section and then the section after that, we're moving to maybe a little more of how to move forward. Um, what are some ideas that we can start talking about to make this different, to to move towards something that isn't based in our Western culture ideas of what works and what doesn't work, and what's successful and what isn't successful. And man, I can't wait to have some of those conversations.
Here's another comment that came in. It says, I had a whoa moment when I read the parable of the tax collector and the Pharisee for the first time. I knew some people in churches who were very much like the Pharisee in the parable and not like the humble tax collector. I don't recall humility as demonstrated by the tax collector as being a sermon topic in the church services I've attended. Humility is another tough sell because it's hard.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Yes. I think I often heard talks on humility. I think humility is a tough practice. Um, I think it's something tough for every one of us. I think it has to do with this whole idea of selfishness, selflessness. Um, it's hard to be selfless. It's hard to be humble, and um, I think it's something we work at all the time. And if we do not work at it, and if we do not put into place some of the things that'll make it so that humility happens, we have to make a choice. It's Jesus saying, it doesn't matter that I'm God. It doesn't matter. I will not consider equality with him something that I've got to grasp, something that I've got to use to my advantage. I'm going to lay down my life. And I think that's so true in all of our lives, that we have to constantly look at things and make that decision. You know, this isn't about me. This is about what I have to give to a world that needs it. So what is it I can give of myself, even though it may be difficult? I will not think my stature, where I stand, um, where I came into life. I won't consider um, the things that have come my way and been given to me as part of my good fortune that I'm going to hold on to and grasp, but instead, I'm going to give my life away. Well, that's tough. I agree. That's selflessness and humility are difficult things, and I have to make constant choices to keep them going. I think they're choices like, give you examples. I think they're choices like saying, if I do something wrong, I will acknowledge it, ask for forgiveness, and say I'm sorry, and do my best to change that in my life. They're those kind of choices. They're not the choices of, um, oh, I'm going to cover that up and look successful. I think there's choices that are there that are very difficult for us always. Thank you for that. Those are incredible thoughts. Anything else? I think that
Well,
leads us. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm just going to kind of add to what you already mentioned. Um, Oftentimes at the end of at the end of these webinars, my question is, so how do we move forward? So what can we do to live this out? And that's why I'm very excited about this last part of Ben's book is all about that. It's about how, or just at least some ideas on how to move forward. I think we certainly invite more discussion on that and what that looks like. But I think it's maybe the laying the foundation of at least some discussions and conversations about what does that look like in moving forward with some of these things that we've talked about, not only this morning, but in previous webinars about, so what do we do with all this? And so I'm really looking forward to starting into part 4. Um, I must admit that the first chapter in part 4, it's called Listen to the Grace Writers, and it's probably one of my favorite chapters of the book. It really resonates with me of listening to those that have extended grace to us. So I really encourage you to jump in and read that chapter for next week. And I'm not sure if we're doing one or two chapters next week. We'll let you know by email.
I believe that it'll be just the first chapter, because to me, it's a vital transition and deals a great deal with what we've already discussed today, but it's the moving forward now and listening to those grace writers and becoming a grace writer, someone who writes grace on others' hearts. I think is vitally important to walking where Jesus has walked. Thank you, everybody. I think we'll close it off with that, and I really look forward to next week. And thank you for being with us this morning.
And ditto for mine. Again, thanks for joining us. We certainly appreciate you taking the time out of your Sunday mornings to join us, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday.